In a previous video, I showed how to prune grapevines, and what we talked about is having a primary trunk developed and then having a secondary vine from the trunk that has some tertiary growth. And once that tertiary growth starts to put on fourth level growth, that whole vine needs to come out. And so that's why we have the trunk, the primary vine with secondary, and then we try to lay on top of the primary vine with the secondary vine. Laying on top of that, we have just a primary vine that will eventually replace the third tier growth, the tertiary growth. And so I know it's kind of confusing. You got to watch the video to understand. But if you've seen that video, you probably will have scenarios like this where you're like, this doesn't apply, Russ. This is not the same as your video. And it kind of is. It's just we got to look at this from a 3D perspective versus a 2D perspective. And so what we have down here, I'll work my way down, but we still have some trunk coming up from the bottom of the deck. So in a perfect world, we'd have one single trunk come up this post, and then along each one of these wooden structures on the covering of the deck, we would have the primary trunk coming up from the bottom. We'd have a secondary vine parallel to this post, and then laying on top of that secondary vine, we would have a secondary vine with tertiary growth on it. So we'd have two parallel vines coming off of the main trunk on each one of these supports. Now, what I'm describing is a perfect scenario. We don't have a perfect scenario here. This grapevine has been neglected over the years and didn't receive a lot of pruning, so we're just going to work with what we got. I showed you the top of the pergola, how messy it is. I'm going to go ahead and just jump in here, thin out a lot of this stuff, and just get it close to what I was describing, but not spending a whole lot of time over analyzing the situation. I just want to make sure that there's a lot of new growth that can produce grapes, and I want to try to remove some of the older growth that is less productive. So something like this, where it's peeling, this old peely 3-4 year old wood, I want to remove a lot of it, and I want to replace it with some of these vines that have the secondary plus the tertiary, because these little nodes here is where the vine is going to put on the new growth, and you're going to have grapes hanging from those nodes. All right, so we just finished up pruning the grapes on the pergola. You can see significantly less vines, and like I mentioned earlier, the goal is to just bring a 2-year-old vine across here with a 1-year-old vine parallel to it. We're not perfect on that, but we just work with what we have. We try to untangle some of the mess, thin out some of the vines. Some of them aren't going to cooperate. We did have to try to tie down some of the vines to keep them in place, but that's it. We just want to make sure that we're removing a lot of the old, keeping some of the new, and then also preparing for some new vines to replace what we cut out next year.